Years ago, when I was a kid, a slogan came out. And the slogan started a revolution. And we have a slide for it. Can we go to the slide? I love New York. Now, I said it started a revolution, right? And you might be scratching your head and say, what do you mean? Now, I'm not talking about what this did for New York's tourism. I'm talking about the revolution of I love, I heart, everything. Okay? This where it started with I love New York. But since then, everywhere you look, you see people professing their love for just about anything. Their dog, the 80s, Julie. Apple computers. Me, I like this one in the corner. Me, that's interesting. Pizza, iHeartRadio. That's actually an app that you can get nowadays where you can listen to music on your phone or your tablet or your computer. Mustaches, a little strange. But the weirdest one is I love zombies. But anyways, but people profess their love for everything. But what about this next one? I love God. This is what we're going to talk about today. I love God. And the question we want to ask this morning is this: does God have your heart? Does God have your heart? There are so many things in this world that compete for our hearts, that compete for our affection, that compete for our loyalty, for our time, and for our praise and adoration. So who or what has your heart? As Christians, as followers of Jesus, our very first answer to that question should be, my God. My God has my heart. But what would that look like? The verses we're going to look at here in Numbers this morning, in Numbers chapter 15, I believe can help us answer that question. And the first thing we see in Numbers chapter 15 is that a heart that belongs to God is a heart that longs to worship your God. And when I say this word longs, that's what I mean. Longs to worship. It's not just, oh yeah, worship is a good thing. And that's just, oh yeah, it's Sunday, let's go to church. But a heart that longs to worship your God, that desires to draw near to God. A heart that looks forward to these regular times of worshiping. And a heart that just spontaneously worships sometimes when you're not even in church. But a heart that longs to worship. To freely express your love for your God. To praise Him. To declare His great worth. From the heart and with all your heart. Look at chapter 15, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land you are to inhabit, which I am giving you, and you offer to the Lord from the herd or from the flock a food offering, or a burnt offering, or a sacrifice, to fulfill a vow, or as a free will offering, or at your appointed feast to make a pleasing aroma to the Lord, then he who brings his offering shall offer to the Lord a grain offering of 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour, mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil. And you shall offer with the burnt offering for the sacrifice 1/4 of a hin of wine for the drink offering for each lamb. Or for a ram, you shall offer for a grain offering 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/3 of a hin of oil. And for the drink offering, you shall offer 1/3 of a hin of wine, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And when you offer a bull as a burnt offering or sacrifice to fulfill a vow or for peace offerings to the Lord, then one shall offer with the bull a grain offering of 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/2 a hin of oil. And you shall offer for the drink offering 1/2 a hin of wine as a food offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Thus it shall be done for each bull or ram or for each lamb or young goat. As many as you offer, so shall you do with each one, as many as there are. Now that was a mouthful. There was a lot that was said there, but before we totally get too far into this, if you were following from what we read last week in chapters 13 and 14, and now what we read in verse 15, you might be scratching your head a little bit and saying, wait a minute, that was a big jump in subject. I mean, the subject matter just changed completely, because remember what happened at the end of last week's? The people had sent spies into the land, and the spies came back, and 10 of them said, we can't do it. After God had said, I'm giving you the land. They said, we can't do it. And the people complained and got all up in arms, and they said, oh, let's go back to Egypt and all this. And they rejected God's gift. And God said, okay, then you're not going to get it. You're not going into the land. So they were banished to the wilderness. And now we change to the subject of giving offerings when you're in the land. How do you bring these sacrifices and bring these offerings to God? Now, these were not just disconnected ideas that were thrown together in the book of Numbers. There's an important connection here. And I think this is to remind us of God's grace. If you remember the phrase in the beginning of chapter 13, in verse 2, God said, go out and spy the land which I am giving to the people of Israel. Look what it says in verse 2 of chapter 15. He says, speak to the people. He says, when you come into the land you are to inhabit, which what? Which I am giving you. You see, things have changed, but some things haven't changed. God is still giving them the land. You see, God is still God. God is still their God. And God is still in a covenant relationship with His people. They are His people. And God is still faithful to His promises. And He will give them the land. But He's going to be giving the land to the younger generation. The older generation won't get it. They lost their opportunity. But the younger generation will still receive the land. And so now He says, because I am still giving you this land, here are the instructions of how you are to honor me or worship me when you come into the land and you receive all the blessings of being in that land from God. And so He changes here and He starts talking about these instructions for sacrifices. And as he goes through here, as the verses we read, you see He names off different animals that could be given as offerings to God. And with each animal, there was a different amount of flour and oil and wine that was to be given along with the animal. And these were given as offerings to God. Now, several things I want you to notice about these things that we read. One, in these offerings, part of the offering was burnt on the altar. And so part of the animal, part of the wine, the flour, the oil, part of it was put on the altar and burned. Part of it was given to the priests. And this is the way God supported the priests. And part of it, of these offerings that were mentioned, were eaten by the people, by the giver, as an act of worship before God. And so it was part of their worship experience. A second thing, you notice it said it was a pleasing aroma to God. Now this again might strike you as kind of strange, because if you think of burning flesh or animal parts, doesn't smell very good. You add to that some flour, wine, oil, flour and oil, that might smell a little bit better, but still burnt. But wine, that might give us a fragrant aroma, some wine evaporating on the hot fire. But it's not the actual smell that God is really pleased with here. When He smells this, or when this aroma goes up. These offerings please God, but it's not the actual burning animal parts of flour, oil, wine that pleases God. It's the person who's giving the offering that pleases God. And when they did this and they had this burning aroma that went up, it was actually a tangible expression of their worship. And it helped connect the person to the act of worship. As they smelled it, they were connected into it, and it was part of their worship experience as they worshiped God and drew near to their God. But God was pleased with it because of the giver. And we know that God looks at the heart. And in fact, when we get into the New Testament, and you remember the story when Jesus was talking with the woman at the well, And she said, well, your people worship there and our people worship here, and which is right? And Jesus says, you know what? God's not really concerned about the place so much as that you worship in spirit and truth. You see, God is concerned with the heart of the worshiper. And so when God's people worship, when we as God's people worship, we express our love for God, and we express the worthiness of God. And God is pleased with it. It's like a soothing aroma in His nose. Third thing I want us to notice is that in this list, there is both order and extravagance. There is order. God tells them specifically how they're to bring these offerings. He gives them specific amounts. This much flour and oil go with this animal. And they probably had something to do with the size of the animal, because you notice the bigger the animal, the more flour and oil and wine they were to bring as well. But there is order here. And the idea, even though there may be a practical reason for it, the most important thing is that they're doing it the way God told them to do it. They were bringing what God told them. They're doing it God's way. But we also see that there is extravagance. You may have noticed as we read and described the flour, it didn't just say flour, it said fine flour. Now this is your good flour. Not just your common, everyday all-purpose flour. But this is your good flour. This is flour that was reserved for banquets, for kings, and for God. Your fine flour, your best flour. You see, they had to come to God the way God told them. But this included bringing only the best. Because only the best is worthy of God. Only your best proclaims His great worth, expresses His great worth. So you bring the fine flour, you bring the best. The fourth thing, these offerings that are listed here, these are not offerings that dealt with sin. These were other kinds of offerings. They're not just offerings that you had to give, but these were offerings that you gave out of the desire of your heart. Free will offerings. These were offerings that you wanted to bring, that you brought to God just because you wanted to. And they were offerings that expressed your love and expressed your gratitude to a merciful and loving and gracious God. And the last thing I want to point out is this. For the Israelites to do these offerings, I think they had to really believe it. I mean, they had to really believe in God. They had to really believe in His grace and His mercy and His promises. They had to truly desire to worship God, because this was costly. It wasn't cheap. I mean, you're talking about bringing your best animals, your best flour, your wine, your oil. This wasn't cheap. It was a costly gift to give to God. And of course, this makes me think of David when he said, "I will not bring an offering to my God that cost me nothing." It's the desire of the worshiper to bring to God and say, "I'm going to give to you whatever it costs me. I'm going to give to you." Now, here's the interesting thing. In chapters 28 and 29, I'm not going to take the time to turn there, but I'm going to just kind of give you a rundown. Of chapter 28 and 29, it describes all the regularly scheduled offerings. So let me give you the rundown of that. First of all, there was daily offerings, and there was one in the morning and one in the evening. In addition to that, you had special Sabbath offerings. So every day, and on the Sabbath, you had an additional offering that you brought, or that the Israelites brought to God. In addition to that, you had a special offering on the first day of each month. In addition to that, there was the Passover offerings and everything you brought and related to the Passover feast. In addition to that, you had the Feast of First Fruits, which we know as Pentecost. In addition to that, you had the Feast of Trumpets, which is now known as the New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and the offerings that were related to that holiday. In addition to that, you had the offerings of the Day of Atonement, when the high priest went into the most holy place and offered up the offering for the sins of himself and then for the sins of the people. In addition to that, you had the Feast of Tabernacles. And in the Feast of Tabernacles, it was 7 days. And each of those 7 days, there were many, 10, 11, 12 animals that were offered. But then in chapter 29, verse 39, it says this: "You shall offer to the Lord at your appointed feasts, in addition to your vow offerings and your free will offerings, for your burnt offerings and for your grain offerings and for your drink offerings and for your peace offerings." He says, you know what? There are regularly scheduled offerings. And then there are those additional offerings that you give just out of your free will, your desire to worship God. And you had these regularly scheduled offerings, and they played an important part in the life of Israel. Because what these regularly scheduled offerings did, every day, every Sabbath, every first of the month, and so on, they kept God continually in front of them. They were continually giving God attention, so they would not forget Him, so they could remember Him. And so kept God continually in front of them. And then you had the free will offerings, these special offerings that were given in addition whenever your heart moved you and you just said, I want to give to God, or I need to make a vow to God. Whenever your heart moved you and you gave these special offerings. Well, let's keep reading some more. Verse 13. He says, "Every native Israelite shall do these things in this way, in offering a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And if a stranger is sojourning with you, or anyone is living permanently among you, and he wishes to offer a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord, he shall do as they do. For the assembly there shall be one statute for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you, a statute forever throughout your generations. You and the sojourner shall be alike before the Lord. One law and one rule shall be for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you." And these verses tell us that God has always welcomed the outsider. God has always welcomed people who would come to Him. However, they had to come, and still have to come, God's way. He says they can come and they can offer these acts, but they have to worship me the way I prescribed. And that's even still true today. God says anyone who will can come. But you still have to come God's way. There's only one way to God. Jesus said it. He said what? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through who? Through Him. Through Jesus. Jesus is the only way to come to God. Anyone who will receive Him by faith can come to God. But you have to come through Jesus. You have to come God's way. Verse 17 says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying to them, When you come into the land to which I bring you, and when you eat of the bread of the land, you shall present a contribution to the Lord. Of the first of your dough, you shall present a loaf as a contribution, like a contribution from the threshing floor, so shall you present it. Some of the first of your dough you shall give to the Lord as a contribution throughout your generations." See, when they come into the land, He's still talking about offerings. When they come into the land and God blesses them with crops, because He will bless. He said, I will bless you. I'm going to give you crops. If you're faithful to me, I will bless you. So when they come into the land and God blesses when they crops, when they harvest those crops, the very first of their harvest, they were to give to God. And they did this in a recognition of His grace. They did it out of gratitude because they knew that everything they had was given to them by God. And because God gave this to them, they were to give back an offering to Him, saying, "Thank you for taking care of me. Thank you for providing this for us." And so we give back to you. Now, I think all these things we've talked about this morning should inform our own worship. in a number of ways. First, everything we have is a gift from God. Everything we have is a gift from God. What has God given you lately? And I'm not just talking about special things or things that you were surprised by, but what has God given you lately? Well, everything you have. But what has He given you lately? And what have you given Him lately? Also, regular weekly worship is not a man-made idea. You know, we didn't just choose, okay, you know what? Every Sunday we're going to get together and worship. This isn't just a man-made idea. Being regular in worship is not something that comes from people, but it's from God. You can see how He lined it out for His people to continually come before Him. This is important for us to do, important for us to continually come before God, to continually give Him our attention, to continually come to worship Him on a regular basis. As Hebrews says, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some is. So some don't do it, but he says that's not the right way. The right way is to regularly be together and worshiping. This is the way God set it up. So we regularly worship, and then we worship on our own whenever we feel like it. But that doesn't mean I come to church whenever I feel like it. Well, you know, I don't feel like going to church today. I don't feel like worshiping today, so I'll stay home. No. We come because it's right. We come because we need to be in front of our God. We need to be worshiping and remembering our God. And then those when I feel like it are on top of that. In addition to that, we worship our God. Another thing is when we're here, when we come together to worship, are you just doing what you're told? I mean, stand up, sit down, sing, pray, listen. In other words, are you just going through the motions? Or are you worshiping from the heart? Are you engaged in what's going on and giving God your offerings from your heart? Are you expressing gratitude to your God? Are you expressing His great worth through your act of worship? Do you bring your best to God? Now, worship is so much more than just singing. But I know many times I've heard people say things like this. I just don't have a great voice. I'm not a good singer. I can't sing. Well, you know what? God gave us the answer to that. Yeah, He said, make a joyful noise. I saw some of you say it. God said, make a joyful noise. It doesn't matter how well you sing. It doesn't matter if you sing better or worse than the person next to you or back behind you or over here. He says, make a joyful noise. In other words, express your best to God. And if your best isn't what others would consider as good as someone else, it doesn't matter. You're bringing your best to God. And say, I'm going to give you my voice. The best that I have, I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give you my heart. I'm going to express your great worth the best I can. And so do you come and you bring Him your best? That's what He asks for. So a heart that belongs to God is a heart that longs to worship Him. But also a heart that belongs to God is a heart that longs for fellowship with your God. Look at verse 22. He says, but if you sin unintentionally and do not observe all these commandments that the Lord has spoken to Moses, all that the Lord has commanded you by Moses, but from the day that the Lord gave commandment and onward throughout your generations, then if it was done unintentionally, without the knowledge of the congregation, all the congregation shall offer one bull from the herd for a burnt offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord, with its grain offering and its drink offering, according to the rule, and one male goat for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for all the congregation of the people of Israel, and they shall be forgiven because it was a mistake. And they have brought their offering, a food offering, to the Lord, and their sin offering before the Lord for their mistake. And all the congregation of the people of Israel shall be forgiven, and the stranger who sojourns among them, because the whole population was involved in the mistake. If one person sins unintentionally, he shall offer a female goat a year old for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement before the Lord for the person who makes a mistake, when he sins unintentionally, to make atonement for him, and he shall be forgiven. You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, for him who is a native among the people of Israel, and for the stranger who sojourns among them. So now we're talking about sacrifices that are given to deal with sin and to restore fellowship with God. So when someone sins, they break their fellowship with God. And that sin must be atoned for. It must be covered to restore fellowship. And specifically in these verses we read, he's talking about sins that were committed unintentionally, whether they were committed by the whole community or just by one individual. But sins that were committed unintentionally. These are sins that broke any of God's commandments, and when they disobey God, but they've done it unintentionally. Now, how can this be? How can you sin unintentionally? Well, the easiest way is when you don't know. If you don't know the law, and then therefore break it, you didn't know. You didn't intend to do it. You didn't purpose in your heart, I'm going to break God's law. You just didn't know about it. The problem is, it's still wrong. It's still sin. And so if you don't know and you sin, you still sin. But God has provided in His grace, provided a way for that sin to be covered and for fellowship to be restored. Now, there's another possible way. It's possible that it could refer to someone who sins impulsively. Like they weren't planning to do it. It's not premeditated. An example of that might be the difference between murder and manslaughter. When someone premeditates and says, I'm going to go kill someone, and when someone is working with their axe and is negligent and the head flies off the handle and kills someone, they didn't plan to kill someone, but yet they were negligent and the person was killed. And so here he's talking about these people who are sinning but unintentionally. Now, if you were to read in Leviticus 6, it talks about this, and it describes someone who sinned in this way. And he says that the person sinned, and then he recognized his sin as what it is, sin. And he can offer a sacrifice with confession. And that is key. With confession. He needs to recognize that what he did was wrong and confess that sin to God. You see, again, we're getting at the heart. The heart of the person who's bringing the sacrifice. He has to recognize what he's done is wrong and to want to be right before God. And when he does this, God will forgive. But, look at verse 30 and 31. It says, but the person who does anything with a high hand, whether he is a native or a sojourner, reviles the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from among his people, because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment. That person shall be utterly cut off. His iniquity shall be on him. He's talking about high-handed sin here. The picture here is of someone who sins with their fist held high, your shaking fist to God and saying, I don't care what you say. Someone who holds up their hand in defiance to God and says, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. And he says, the person who does this, who sins in a high-handed way, is to be put out of the camp. He's refusing. He knows what he should do, but he's refusing to submit to God. And for this person, there is no sacrifice. There's no sacrifice for this intentional sin because they have committed this sin with complete disregard for God and in rebellion against God. And it says that they were to be cut off. In other words, they were to be put out of the camp. They were separated from the people of God and the blessings of God. But ultimately, they were to be put to death. Why such a drastic punishment? It's because they've blasphemed God. These are people who were part of the covenant community. They know God. They know what He has commanded. They all said, we will be faithful. We'll do it, what you said. They're part of the covenant community, and now they have chosen to rebel against their God. Their actions have demonstrated what's in their heart. That they had rejected their God and His covenant. But now in the following verses, we're given an example. Look at verse 32. It says, while the people of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. They put him in custody because it had not been made clear what should be done to him. And the Lord said to Moses, this man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones as the Lord commanded Moses. This man had committed a high-handed sin. You might think, well, that's not that big a deal. He's gathering some sticks. Well, he was gathering sticks probably for a fire or something to build his fire, but he was doing work on the Sabbath. His regular, everyday work on the Sabbath. Even though he knew he wasn't supposed to, he was doing it in disregard to what God had said. And so there he is, and he was caught. The people said, what do we do with him? And God said he's to be put to death. Now I imagine probably what happened in this situation is the guy was out gathering sticks and some other people saw him and they said, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing? You shouldn't be doing that. It's the Sabbath. And the guy said, so? I don't care. And so then they brought him to Moses. And I imagine that if the guy had said, oh yeah, and dropped his sticks, something would have been a little bit different. See, because I think, again, you see a different heart in the person. Now, if he had committed this high-handed sin, he's still guilty. But if he was convicted of that sin, well, there's still no sacrifice for it. But what he can do is fall in the mercy of God and wait. Wait to see if God will forgive and accept. We have an example of that in David. And this is why David wrote in Psalm 51, after he committed his sin with Bathsheba and then had her husband put to death. David wrote in Psalm 51, he said, God, you don't delight in sacrifice. There was no sacrifice to cover this kind of sin. He said, but the sacrifice you want is a broken and contrite heart. You want someone who is going to humble themselves before you and say, God, I was wrong. Please forgive me. And then in Psalm 19, David writes, he says to God, reveal our hidden faults. You know, those unintentional sins. Those things that we didn't realize we had done. He said, reveal those to us so we can confess those or not take part in those. And he says to guard us against presumptuous sins or those high-handed sins. So that our hearts might be acceptable before you. You see, if your heart belongs to God, it doesn't mean that you're perfect. It doesn't mean that you never sin. But you long to be in right fellowship with Him. But how does that work out for us today? I mean, there are no more sacrifices. But the reason why there are no more sacrifices is because the one sacrifice of Jesus covered every sin. Jesus his death covers all sins. His death purifies everyone who believes in him. We are all sinners, and our sin has cut us off from God, separated us from God, headed towards death, eternal death and damnation in hell. But Jesus died in our place. Jesus came and lived a sinless life and died in our place, taking our sin, the punishment of our sin, upon himself so that we could be forgiven. And so we could be brought into right fellowship with God. And everyone who believes in Jesus, putting their trust in him, trusting that his death on the cross paid the price for our sins, is forgiven by God. And is made a child of God. And is brought into a right relationship with God. Of course, we know, those of us who have come into a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, we know that we still sin. But again, God has provided, through the death of Jesus, continued forgiveness for our sins. If we confess our sins, he says in 1 John 1:9, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. He will keep us pure. He will restore us to fellowship with him because of Jesus. So a heart that belongs to God is a heart that longs to be in close fellowship with him. And thirdly, a heart that belongs to God is a heart that longs to follow your God. Look at verse 37 through 41. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. So you shall remember and do all my commandments and be holy to your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God." You see, God told the Israelites to wear tassels on their clothes. Now, this wasn't a fashion statement. It wasn't to look pretty, but it was a memory device. It was for them to remember. So when the tassels moved as they walked, as they moved in the wind, or as they brushed across their leg, they would see them, and when they looked at them, they would remember the word of the Lord. They would remember the commandment of the Lord. And it would remind them to be obedient to those commandments, to live in fellowship with their God, to follow their God, to do what he has told them to do. And so they would see this, and it would remind them of God, and that they were his people, and that they were to obey. What's interesting in this passage is, again, the heart is mentioned. But here when he mentions the heart, it's not necessarily a good thing. Because he says, don't follow your heart. So following your heart isn't necessarily a good thing. He says, because when you follow your heart, what do you tend to do? Go your own way and disobey God. But he says, so you have these tassels to help you, remind you not to do what your heart is naturally inclined to do, but to be obedient. So this was a way for them to keep in mind the things of God, and for them to do the things God has told them to do, and to keep the ways of God ever in front of their eyes. Now, why would they do this? Because he is their God. And that's how he closes. He says, I am the Lord your God. I brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. See, he voices their relationship with him. He says, I am your God. I saved you. I delivered you from Egypt. I am your God. Therefore, you be obedient to me. You follow me. And for us today, it's true. The same is true. He is our God. He has saved us. He is our God. It only makes sense that we would follow and be obedient. Now, I had to think about these tassels, and there's many ways that we do things just like those tassels that remind you about God and keep the things of God in front of you. I used to, when I first met Julie, I always wore a cross around my necklace, on a necklace. I always had the cross, and I was always playing with it too. But it reminded me of who I was, who I belonged to, and my Savior. I know many people who carry things in their pockets, little crosses or coins or things to remind them about the commandments of God, to be obedient to God. But there are all the other ways that we do this as well. We regularly read the Word of God. We have that benefit that some of these people, they didn't have. We have it with us in our own homes. We can regularly read the Word of God. I know many people who put verses on cards and they'll stick it up on a mirror or on the dash of their car or on their visor or things where they just see it and they're reminded of the commandments of God. They're reminded of who they are, who they belong to, and how they want to live. People will put it on artwork and hang it on their walls. People will put it on T-shirts. We come to church to be reminded of those things. We gather around with friends who are believers who help remind us of those things. There are many ways that we do this to remind us of the ways of God. But the important thing is that we are reminded and that we are following our God and being obedient to God. Because a heart that belongs to God is a heart that longs to follow. And in order to follow, you've got to remember. So does your heart belong to God? Or maybe, do you want to give more of your heart to God? These things that we've seen this morning are more than just descriptive of a heart that belongs to God. They also tell us, if we do these things, they will also cause us to grow in our commitment and in our gratitude towards God. So first of all, you need to know Him. You need to come to God through faith in Jesus Christ. And if you haven't done that, I would encourage you to do so today. Humble yourself before Him, confess your sin, and say, I need a Savior. So you come to Him through Jesus, but then you need to continue to learn about Him, to remember His ways. Keep those things ever in front of you. Think on Him. Think on His ways. Think on His truth. And when you do that, then you will recognize sin as sin. And you will be able to either avoid that sin or you will confess that sin to be brought back into right fellowship with God. It will cause you to desire to be holy and to remain in close fellowship with Him. And as you walk daily in close fellowship with your God, the worship will just overflow out of your heart. And the more you do these things, the more your heart will long for your God.